Threshold and myself with the opportunity to address your annual conference on that relationship between economic inequality and the housing crisis. And obviously this afternoon we're looking at housing shortage, and I'm going to be looking at the human impact of that housing shortage and some of those stories. So I guess who we are, we're a national housing charity with regional advice centres in Dublin, Cork and Galway. And our core work really is to advise and empower tenants and prevent homelessness, essentially, through our National Tenancy Protection Service. So we advocate for a fair, sustainable sector for tenants and landlord alike, but with a clear emphasis on supporting, informing and representing renters. And I'm sure, I'm speaking to a kind of a home audience here when I talk about a vision that we have for Ireland where everyone has access to affordable, secure, suitable and good quality housing. So I've done a few presentations recently where I've put some slide up which is about like sustainable housing and good housing and social housing and like they're all from like the Netherlands and other civilized countries in Northern Europe. And then I was trying to think of like how you visually represent that absence, that lack of sustainable communities, that lack of social housing supply or housing supply. And essentially all I can come up with is a big black hole, okay? So this is an artist's impression of a big black hole. I'll give a prize at the end for the nerd who can tell me what film that was inspired by, but we'll leave that till later. So I mean, how do you represent that lack? How do you represent that absence of housing from our communities? And how do you visualize something that's not there? Okay, and the closest I can get is this. It sucks all the energy. It distorts everything around it, and it kind of infinitely stretches and pressurizes anything unfortunate enough to fall within its gravity. So I think that's a fair enough description of the situation facing many people, and including the people we meet and support due to the prolonged housing shortage. So I guess this afternoon I'm viewing the shortage where it manifests itself most acutely, and that is in the private rented sector, and among lower income and more vulnerable tenants in particular. The private rented sector is where most lower income households live, yet issues related to quality, affordability, tenure security are common, and the sector continues to be a pathway to a number of things really: financial hardship, poor health due to low physical standards, overcrowding, as Lorcan has mentioned, and ultimately homelessness. So it is a pathway, it's still a pathway to homelessness, despite many recent welcome policy measures. So in terms of an overview for the rest of the input, we've rehearsed the relationship between inequality and housing. I'm going to look at who is being affected, how they're being affected, what we're doing about it as an organisation, and what else is and what else can be done about it. And of course, look, it would be remiss of me to consider who's affected without mention of Grenfell Tower. And the spectre of Wednesday's fire in London does serve as an extreme reminder of that relationship between economic inequality and housing. So back in Ireland, who is being affected by that housing shortage? A number of households have been named. So for ourselves, what I did in the last number of weeks, last month or so, is asked our advisors in the Dublin region to provide case studies reflecting the kind of renters and the type of issues they face. And many of the scenarios will be unsurprising, but I think it's important to tell those stories. They are a diverse bunch, including older tenants, and I think that's a very important cohort to be mindful of, given their lack of assets, given the whole issues around pensions and care and health and physical access and design. Lone parents, persons with a disability in the household requiring full-time or close to full-time care, foreign nationals, tenants who are sharing parenting, and that will be that is a reality now, and it will be an increasing issue, and I'll come back to that. And renters who are on or trying to access the housing assistance payment, which has been mentioned already. So in terms of the older tenant, I'll give you a couple of these are literally brief potted stories, but an older tenant in receipt of state pension and rent supplement with multiple medical problems. They faced a doubling of their rent from $900 to $1,800 a month. Now, the matter was dealt with by way of telephone mediation, and with the tenant's permission, our Tenancy Protection Service contacted the property owners to discuss their circumstances. And there was an arrangement with a thing called the Rent Supplement Protocol, which enables, through the Department of Social Protection, elevations of rent supplement. So the rent went up to only $1,300. So we kind of phrased that as a win, even though the rent went up from $800 to $1,300, because the spectre was $1,800 a month. So that's the kind of situations we're dealing with. A lone parent with a child with a disability. So it's a full-time carer with her son, and in receipt of rent supplement. They faced an increase of from £1,000 to €1,800, and the Threshold Tenancy Protection Service, or the TPS as I'll call it henceforth, contacted the landlord or agent and got an emergency uplift of the rent supplement through the protocol. However, her current housing situation is very unstable, and we're working with other agencies to find a more sustainable housing solution. Foreign nationals, Brazilian English language student, reported that he was staying in a place where there was 22 people in a 3-bed house and paying rent to an agent, which was probably someone who was subletting illegally. The client moved to an apartment with one of the other housemates, and is pretty content, pretty relieved, to be honest. And Threshold gave them the local authority details and advised them to inform the local authority of the overcrowding in the property. A parent with joint custody of children and who has applied for housing assistance payment. In that situation, the person was assessed as a single man. The local authority won't consider him for a higher amount as the children are not on his housing assessment. The rent supplement, which would be more accommodating, if you like, is not possible due to the rollout of the housing assistance payment rather than rent supplement. So the local authority does not grant additional space for what they called, and I thought this was an awful phrase, what they called access children. At a time where we are very much embracing kind of diversity of families, but there you go, that was the phrase that was used. So hence the restriction to assessment as a single person for that man. Both parents have a social housing application, and the dependent children will only be included as part of one parent's housing applications. Therefore, the flexibility of rent supplement does not seem to be available with HAP payments, and there's a strong possibility of him having to return to the courts. So there's a whole interaction of issues there. A foreign national single parent with a rent increase. There was a notice of termination from her landlord, as he said he intended to sell the property. The landlord did not wish to end the tenancy, but due to financial pressures, felt he had no choice. Due to a language barrier, there had been a misunderstanding in relation to the previously flagged rent increase, and we successfully secured an increase under that social protection protocol and sustained the tenancy. And then another one in terms of a lone parent with 3 children, living in a tenancy since 2012. The rent increased 2 years later, and the parent topped up that rent with various payments and entitlements. And then the rent supplement was increased last summer again to reflect that. But a further increase was sought by the landlord recently. And again, a further protocol increase was sought. So there's this ratcheting up to try and fill that gap. So it took a long time to approve due to the paperwork sought by the department. And it was a stressful enough time. But we secured that. And yet, I mean, this is a very questionable use of resources, either through rent supplement or indeed through the housing assistance payment. And that is a legacy of a complete dearth of social housing provision from, I would argue, the 80s, which is a deliberate policy choice by both of the large political parties since the 1980s right through to now. So I don't know why any of us should be surprised of the crisis that certainly has faced us over the last 3 years. So in terms of the kind of issues, I've mentioned a number of them there. Yesterday's rent index by the Residential Tenancies Board does show a decrease in Dublin rents and indicates a moderation nationally, although it is too early to determine an overall trend at this time. Simultaneously, we've encountered a cohort of landlords in these rent pressure zones, which cover the majority of tenancies now in urban areas, who are blatantly flouting the 4% cap on rent increases. And some sitting tenants who refuse a rent increase above the 4% face retaliatory evictions. A landlord in Dublin, for example, sought an illegal rent review, and when his tenants protested, advising that the new rent pressure zone rules, he served a notice under a thing called Section 34B, which would enable him to terminate the tenancy. And that allows, in certain circumstances, a termination without needing a justifiable reason. And tenancy termination, as you can see from that bar chart, it is the main issue facing clients nationally so far this year. And on this slide, following, I guess, that, there's the rent reviews as the second issue, seeking accommodation due to the housing shortage, standards and repairs, obviously an exceptionally topical issue right now. That accounts for about 15% or over 1,400 of our caseload last year. And of course, deposit retention by the landlord, which continues to be a contentious issue. So other issues facing clients include being caught between the landlord and the receiver. Renovations to circumvent the rent pressure zones, you can avoid the rent pressure zone 4% stipulation if you do what is regarded as substantial renovation to the home. Problems with accessing the housing assistance payment and problems with the payment itself, which I mentioned earlier. Language barriers and the precarious status of being a thing called a licensee, someone essentially in digs or similar. So maybe just to flag up quite a contemporary issue, which is where tenants are caught between landlord and receiver. A good number of cases we're working with right now and have done recently. One where a single older tenant in an apartment in receivership, excuse me, where the landlord's daughter told all tenants not to engage with the receiver and to pay rent to her. So there was uncertainty and confusion for all the tenants, plus notices of termination from the landlord's daughter issued on the grounds of refurbishment to all of the dissenting voices within the block. So rather than a genuine attempt to refurbish, that's what happened to them. And we advise the client to continue to pay rent to the receiver and for others to contact Threshold in that regard. And what we're also seeing increasingly is that some landlords are manipulating that substantial renovations exemption in the legislation. Okay, so one case was in Cork where there was close to a 30% increase on the previous tenant's rent on the basis that the carpet had been replaced and the property had been painted. Newsflash, that does not constitute a substantial renovation, although that doesn't stop some landlords for making those claims. And in Dublin, a landlord notified our clients that the property would undergo substantial renovations, yet the repairs amounted to minor maintenance and some insulation improvements. So there's a number of issues there. How long have I got? 5, okay. So another issue which Lorcan mentioned there is overcrowding. So overcrowding in rented accommodation has become quite a substantial issue for us. Growing instances of, if you like, individuals and families, indeed, sofa surfing, and situations of multiple generations of families living under the same roof because of that inability of younger generations to source affordable accommodation. And what we're seeing in terms of assisting and interfacing with people on the phone and face-to-face is huge impacts on relationships, on quality of life, and on mental and therefore physical health. And there is currently no suitable definition of overcrowding, which we feel needs to be inserted into existing minimum standards, or the minimum standards there's a raft coming in the 1st of July. So that needs to be augmented, and in legislation generally. So in terms of the Tenancy Protection Service, and this is a bit of a historic image now, given the last 48 hours or 72 hours. But okay, so what are we doing about it as a housing charity? Well, I guess regarding supports for renters most exposed to the housing shortage and at risk of homelessness, our two key supports to the general public are the Tenancy Protection Service and the Housing Advice Service. So these big kind of radiation warnings that you've seen, if you've been around Dublin at all, that's for our service. It's the 1800 number. Our branding isn't on it, but that's okay as long as the number's out there. So the Tenancy Protection Service is our support to renters across the state. So, I mean, where people are worried, renting and worried about losing their tenancy, it's accessed via a free phone number. It's 999. It's the 1800 454 454 number. And it does play a crucial role in keeping people in their homes and preventing homelessness. And the National Public Awareness Campaign was launched that morning, 23rd of May, with the then Minister for Housing. And it has, however, been around since the middle of 2014, the Tenancy Protection Service, at least in Dublin. And Dublin has dealt with 10,000 calls since then, helped almost 3,000 households. So I guess what is it? The three supports that it provides are immediate guidance about rights as tenants and landlord regulations, negotiation between tenant and landlord to resolve problems and take further action if needed, including referral to the Residential Tenancies Board, and thirdly, guidance on how to apply to the Department of Social Protection for an uplift, although we're seeing less and less of those referrals, and sometimes that's partly because the Department of Social Protection have certain means at their own disposal before cases get to ourselves. And of course, we provide a more general housing advice service. So, what else? What can be done? What is being done? I guess, well, the main answer is social housing and social housing build. As we know, output is very, very slow, incredibly slow, and in any event, the private rented sector will, for good or ill, always play a role in housing across the income distribution. Unfortunately, the road to regulation and standards within the private rented sector has been a very slow and arduous one, with modest stipulations placed on landlords until the recent legislation. The 2004 Act was certainly a positive departure, but it wasn't until last year's rent strategy and the related legislation that substantial measures related to affordability and tenure security made the statute book. And I guess this is where the quote used by Professor David Andres in response to Grenfell Tower is particularly salient. So what do we, and I'll come back to it, but I guess what we are advocating for through our policy and legal work is around the changes to the rental strategy, the legislation from 2016, minimum standards, energy efficiency, overcrowding, hidden homelessness, licensees. In fact, I'm not sure if he's here, but we have a researcher working on licensees in Cork, and he'll be doing some work in a joint piece between Threshold and UCC. So I guess regarding the rental strategy, we'll continue to advocate for that tenure reform and for indefinite tenancies and for limitations on the use of sale of a property as grounds for terminating a tenancy. The issue of tenants' rights during receivership continues to be one of the most common complaints to our advice line, and we believe that the legal uncertainty over those obligations of receivers must be addressed by way of legislation, and we will advocate strongly for that, and will continue to lobby for a deposit protection scheme, given its importance to both tenants' rights and homeless prevention. Monitoring and enforcement of the 2016 legislation, it is required to avoid further penalisation of vulnerable tenants. Okay, for time, yeah. So I just want to leave you with this slide, which speaks for itself, really, around what is often lamented as, unnecessary legislation or regulation or onerous regulation, red tape, bureaucracy. And I guess it's food for thought for anyone who is advocating for less regulation or lighter touch regulation, given what we've all witnessed in the last number of days. So we are in the private residential area. It will be a place where many of us will live. At least let's legislate and regulate accordingly. Thanks very much.